Hi, I'm Phil Cooke, and welcome to the Phil Cooke Podcast. So often people come to me asking about how to get invited to speak at conferences. And I've talked about this before, but I'm getting so many lately that I wanted to really address some of the techniques and some of the ways you can get invited. Now, before you think this is not for you, remember that getting invited to speak at conferences can be a huge step for getting your name out there, advancing your career, getting your message heard, people hearing about the projects you're interested in. There's so many ways speaking at workshops or conferences or other events can really take you to the next level. So stay tuned, because we're going to talk a little bit about how to get invited to speak at conferences that can make a real difference for you. So often people will come to me asking about speaking at conferences. And now, like I say, if you've never thought of this before, or if you think this is not for you, before you walk away, let me just say it is an important way to advance your career. Being able to speak to small groups or to speak at a workshop or a symposium, or, there's so many events out there that we can speak at. I just got back from Brazil, where I spoke to 7,000 pastors and ministry leaders at one event. And that's an amazing experience. And then I spent the day talking to a smaller group of a couple hundred pastors, doing some intensive training and teaching about media. So whatever your line of work is, whether you're in real estate or business or a teacher, whatever, if you want to speak at conferences and events, I just think it's such an important way to advance your career and go to the next level in your life. So I want to talk specifically about some important things, because it's amazing to me the number of people that are really quite accomplished in their career but have no clue how to get invited to speak at events. I remember at a couple national conferences every year that I speak at, literally a week before the conference, people will call me and say, "Phil, can you put in a good word for me? I'd like to speak at that conference." Well, the speaking list has been decided for 9 months. The event has been pretty much planned for a year. They're not going to invite last-minute speakers, and unless somebody fails to show up. They're just not going to invite speakers at the last minute. And there's a way you need to know about how to get on that list to be invited. So today we're going to talk about that. Let me give you 5, 6, 7 little thoughts and ideas that will help you. Number one, a great way to start is just volunteering at conferences and events. Find the kind of conferences in your career or your workspace or your business that you think would be helpful, and offer to go in and volunteer. Set up chairs, do the registration table, get behind the scenes and learn how the conference works, because in doing that, you start to get known by the people that make the decisions about who to invite. I remember the first conference I ever spoke at was a conference on religious media. It was on Christian media. And I was just helping. I was there to help. I was just behind the scenes, working, helping happen. And there was a panel of about 5 major Christian leaders, all high, really heavy hitters, big people that were in ministry. They were going to talk about their own experience with Christian media, why it had helped their ministry. And literally the afternoon of the event, we were going to speak at like 3 o'clock. And at 11 or 12 at noon, we discovered one of those speakers, his flight was canceled, and he was never going to make it. He was just not going to be able to get there. And so they didn't know what to do. And so the director of the conference, I just happened to be there because I was working it. He turned to me and said, "Well, Phil, you're a director. Why don't you go in and why don't you sit in and you take his place at the conference?" I had never spoken at a conference before, ever. That was the very first time. And it didn't happen because I was some kind of genius. Didn't happen because I had, enormous experience, because I didn't at the time. It only happened because I happened to be there. And I happened to be there because I was volunteering, helping set up at the conference. That's it. That's the only reason I got invited. So, just being at the right place at the right time can make a dramatic difference for you. So find the conferences that you think you might like to speak in at some point in the future, and at least start volunteering. Get to know them. Be available to them. And as you do, talk to people about what you do for a living and how you do it, and suddenly things will spark and you never know what could happen. The second thing is become an expert. Become known as somebody who's an expert in your field. I think this is important for leaders of all kinds, but particularly when you want to speak at conferences, they generally look for somebody who's considered an expert. Now, and you can make yourself an expert, by the way. Early in my career, like literally in my 20s, I had the really remarkable opportunity of filming in a number of countries, mostly third world countries. And I was doing it literally all over the world, and it was all really difficult places I was filming. And I'd done that quite a bit in my 20s. And so I wanted to speak at conferences. I wanted to write some articles for some magazines. And I thought about, okay, I'm only in my 20s. What are they going to want from me? And then I realized, I know a lot about how to film in really difficult situations overseas. And so I started writing some articles about that. And I started offering to speak about that at some conferences and events. And suddenly I was getting published. I was getting invited to speak because there's so much involved in that. How do you get permits? How do you get the equipment there? How do you deal with customs? There's just so many things. How to navigate, the different languages, how to arrange for transportation. There's just a million different things involved in that one field alone. And so I had enormous experience, even though I was young, and I figured that was my niche. And so I started there, and that's how I started to get on the radar. I started because that's something I happen to be pretty good at doing and having a lot of experience at. So before long, a big conference asked me to share on that subject, a media conference, and I was off and running. Suddenly I got in front of a lot of people, and they saw that I knew what I was talking about in that particular field, and suddenly I started getting invited to speak at other places as well. So become an expert. Think of it. What have I done in my career? And it can be it can be all kind of niches. Maybe it's how I went from Indianapolis to Hollywood, how I carved a path and navigated my way into the industry, and how I'm working there today. It could be any number of things, how I developed a particular product over the years, how I led and inspired a creative team. Whatever it is, that's a niche that you should focus on. Become an expert at that, and that's going to help get you invitations to speak. The third thing is plan ahead. I mentioned earlier the number of people that call me the week before a major conference and ask me to pitch them to speak at the event. Well, as I said, those things got planned months and months and months, sometimes a year ago. So plan ahead. Don't think you're going to speak at the conference that's happening next month. Maybe the conference is happening next year. In fact, if you really start studying these, if you get behind the scenes by volunteering and get involved in some of these events, you'll see many of these, particularly keynotes, are planned out years in advance. So never start. It's never too early to start. Start planning ahead because it's so very, very important. Number 4, understand that you don't need an agent. Many friends of mine have speaking agents. Many don't. I've never really had a speaking agent. I've had a number of people who have offered to help me get speaking gigs, and I've never really used an agent, certainly exclusively for speaking events. If you have one, great, but don't feel like you need one. Don't feel like you're not going to get invitations without it, because truly what an agent will, I can go into agents all day long because it's true with book agents and acting agents and producing agents and speaking agents. Agents really don't get you work. For the most part, they don't get you work. They will navigate, negotiate, work out the deal, but they're generally not going to give you work. I have a friend of mine who is enormously successful and very proficient director of episodic TV shows. He's retired now, but he spent his whole career regularly directing hundreds of episodes of episodic television. And he told me he's had one of the top agents in Hollywood during that whole time. And he said, my agent never got me a single job, not a single job. He said, my agent will negotiate the deal. He'll usually get me a better deal than I would have on my own. But he said, he's never once gotten me any work. And so you need to understand the role of agents. Certainly some of them will probably go pitch you. Some of them will get you work. Great. I wish more did. But in most of the experience of friends of mine that I know, their agents don't get them jobs. They get the jobs, they bring it to an agent. So I think that's important for you to know. You don't have to have an agent, a speaking agent, to get a job as a speaker. And then finally, take the time to become a great speaker. This is one of my frustrating things. Just because you're an expert at something, just because you may be well known, just because you may be a nice person, doesn't mean you're going to be a great speaker. I've hosted a number of big conferences. My wife Kathleen and Peggy Ruppel co-produced and directed the Biola Media Conference, which was the largest conference secular conference of Christians who worked in the industry there's ever been. They had it on the lot at CBS Studios for years and years, and they would get 600-700 people that came. They were all Christians in the industry, but they were working in secular media. They weren't working in Christian media. They were working in secular media, and these were high-level people. I mean, I interviewed, and I hosted in a number of years. I hosted the events. And I interviewed the president of Walt Disney Studios. I would interview major producers and directors and actors. And I learned pretty quickly that you may be the head of a studio, you may be an incredible producer, but that doesn't make you a great speaker. And so very often when I knew this about people, I would arrange to interview them rather than let them speak, because they would be terrible as speakers. So if you want to be successful as a speaker, learn to speak. Take the time. There's some great books out there on speaking. There's some great resources online on speaking. I just think that it's incredibly important to learn to speak well. Get comfortable. Learn to be spontaneous. And one of the things that my wife Kathleen and I discovered on some recent trips overseas at big events is they switch things up on you at the last minute. So we planned, there was one particular event that we just came back from. That was a big conference. And at the last minute, they decided to switch our topics. And they moved us around. And we had to completely rethink everything we were going to do at the last minute. So that's going to happen to you. And a great speaker can do that. One who's an amateur or somebody who's not very good at speaking is really going to struggle and stumble and do a terrible job. So I just can't overemphasize that enough. Because here's the thing. If you're not going to be a great speaker, you'll get your chance maybe because you're an expert at something, or you know somebody, or you happen to be there. You'll get up to speak, but nobody's going to invite you for anything else because you didn't do a great job. People are going to invite you to more events because you blew them away as a speaker. So take the time, learn to be good. I often will just close the door to my office and I will practice my speech over and over and over again. I'll do my talk over and over again. And I learned to do it with notes, without notes, with a PowerPoint. And by the way, let me just say this about PowerPoint. Learn to speak well first, then bring the PowerPoint into it. PowerPoint can become an incredible crutch, and it doesn't really help you. It's just a distraction if you really haven't mastered how to use it well. In many ways, when I use PowerPoints or keynotes for my Mac, I want it to be a conversation with me and the slides. I want to respond and react to the slides, and the audience enjoys that. They get more out of it. It's much more interactive. So there's techniques you can use that make it much more interesting. So the bottom line is learn to be a great speaker. I think that's so important. So let's just go over everything real quick one time. Number one, show up. Volunteer at events. Be at events that you think you might be a good speaker for, and offer to volunteer. Set up chairs, do the registration table, help plan behind the scenes. Get to know the people that run those conferences because they'll get to know you. And just being there, that was my first speaking engagement, was because I just happened to be there. Number two, become known as an expert in an area. Find your area of expertise. They're not going to hire you to speak if you don't have anything to talk about. If you're not known for something, if you really don't have a focused area of expertise, they're not going to be interested. So become an expert. Number three, plan ahead. Don't forget, they're planning these conferences and events way ahead of time. Now, having said that, I would also be available if something comes up at the last minute. Like I said, my first gig happened because somebody canceled. There are often times when someone doesn't work out, or someone comes up with a little meeting or event off the cuff at the last minute and asks you to speak. Always be ready. The Bible talks about sharing your testimony, being ready in season and out of season. It's the same thing with speaking. Always have something up your sleeve you could share at the last minute, but generally speaking, plan ahead. Number four, no, you don't need an agent. Don't worry about that. Don't let that hold you back. And number five, learn to become a great speaker. Learn to become a great speaker. One of the best books on speaking I've ever encountered is by a friend of mine who wrote a book called Give Your Speech, Change the World. Write that down. Give Your Speech, Change the World. It's a fantastic book, short, to the point book on how to speak. I think it's important. I think there's so many resources out there that can really, really help you. So go out there, become an amazing, amazing speaker. Thanks for tuning in. I really appreciate you watching this episode or listening to this episode. It's so important that you share this with friends. Certainly, you know people that need to speak, or really want to speak, have a real desire to speak, but they don't know how to take that first step. Share this with them. It could be the spark that really helps them really move on to the next level of their life. Now, when it comes to speaking and teaching, one of the things we do with our nonprofit called the Influence Lab is help Christians internationally. We go teach and train them to use media, to speak, to use social media, to share the gospel in the part of the world they're in. Sometimes these are hostile places. Sometimes these are third world places. They're difficult places. But media is the language of the world these days. So it's a big vision. And if you feel like you could help us, we would love, go to influencelab.com and you'll see how to donate. We'd just really be grateful if you felt led to donate to that, because I think it's such an important work, and we're getting invitations all the time. We were just in India teaching. We were just in Brazil teaching. We're going to be going to the Middle East teaching, which is really important right now. So I think the work that we do to try to help teach and train Christians internationally is critically important. I want to change the church's definition of missions to not just be about geographical boundaries, to be about digital boundaries. You know, by population, the largest country on the planet is Facebook. But who's sending missionaries to that country? Who's planting churches in that country? Let's raise up a generation of people that know how to reach people online, because it's become so incredibly important. Thanks for whatever you can do to donate and give and support and help that effort. Until next week or till next time, tune in. I've got many more incredible podcasts coming up, and we appreciate what you're doing. Thanks for supporting and being a part of this.